Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Thank you for joining us for the Practical Preservation Podcast. Today we have Robert Chickey from Bespoke-Finish. Thank you for joining us today, Robert.
Thank you so much.
So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into wood finishing?
I was a painting contractor for 22 years or so. I started my second company in 1990, and I did a lot of new construction and really got bored with it.
Right.
We always worked at the high end of the market, but back in the 90s, everything was white, and literally to this day, I cannot tolerate white. And so I went into wood finishing. I just transitioned into it. And what struck me when I really decided that I was going to go into wood finishing was everything was brown and shiny, and it made no sense to me. Really, I taught myself how to approach wood finishing differently, and it was really based on my love of antiques.
Oh, I could see that. And I was just thinking, in the 90s, I know that my dad has a real aversion to red oak. I'm sure you were seeing a lot of red oak too.
I hate red oak.
I know that there's a lot of shininess in some antiques, depending on the finish, the real high gloss things. But were you more focused on the making the graining come out? Is that what your focus turned into? Okay.
So in a traditional method today, modern coatings, we're talking, they're focused on two things: color and applying a protective coating, period.
Right.
And so if you lose the wood in that process, they don't really care. That made no sense to me.
Right.
I mean, to this day, I don't use stain. I never used stain. If you go back and look, and this is what I did, I went back and looked at information from the 1600s, 15, 16, 1700s, what they were using. Now, there really wasn't a lot of information out there.
Right.
There certainly wasn't books. I mean, the books that were out there were really more journals from makers at that time.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, there's university material, but again, that's more the science side.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important too. And I did read it, believe me. For me to understand how to get what I wanted, which was to see the wood.
Yeah, and you need to understand the chemical reactions and the what you add to different species of wood. Because I know we've aged oak, using some of those methods just because they wanted a patina faster. So
sure.
you have to understand the chemistry. So I could even though those would be hard to wade through, I could see needing to read those.
Absolutely. So I decided that if I was going to color wood the path that made sense, as you were talking about, was reactive color. Now, reactive color is just what you're saying, is building a patina in a wood. But, the traditional methods that exist that are commonly known, the iron acetate, everybody knows that, making the wood black or
Right.
gray, depending on the reaction. There's literally thousands of things that you can use, and 90% of them are organic. And so you can design finishes using these methods in water and then building your color out. And so back in the mid 90s, transitioned to wood finishes primarily, almost exclusively. And I had a company, and at that time I probably had a staff of 8. The largest I got was 12, which was plenty big.
Right.
And we traveled all over the country because the situation exists like this. You have an existing intact house, intact finish. Let's say the house is mid 1800s, and they want to add on. The predominant thought today is you can't make that match. And
Right.
I'm just like, that's wrong. I've taken rooms where they have literally interlaced new wood into an existing intact historic finish, and I can't tell where it is anymore.
Right.
It is completely possible. You just cannot use modern materials and modern processes.
Right. It won't give you the same effect or the same finish.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was really about honing my knowledge about how to get that and use materials that were, prevalent in the mid 1800s.
Right.
Now, in Minnesota, we don't have much housing stock or buildings beyond the mid 1800s. Now, on the East Coast, that's a different story. But, if you educate yourself on what's possible, you can get that. And today you can take some modern materials and some reactive product and blend them to achieve X. It is possible.
Yeah. And I would assume, building styles changed, but the basics of the building styles remain the same. So I would assume that the finishes would also then be similar.
Right.
That they didn't change that much. They weren't trying to innovate in those ways necessarily.
Right. If you're playing in trying to capture a period build, if you have a period build, sometimes you get architects that want to take a period build to a more modern approach.
Right.
And that's fine. As long as the continuity flies in that house or in a building or whatever you want, I'm all in for that. I really do not have any interest in producing modern things because
Right.
you're missing the point for me, which
Yeah.
is why color the wood so that you can't see it.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. And the other flip side to that is it always makes me giggle when the vinyl siding or any of the synthetic sidings make the grain pop, and I'm like, when wood's painted like that, you don't see the grain. Like that doesn't make sense either.
I know. It's like
so opposite side, but they're trying to make it fancy. So
people don't ask questions. They really don't.
And they don't
just
think
want
about
easy.
It. Yeah.
They want easy.
Yeah, that is true. So, and they've sold everybody on this idea of being maintenance free, which nothing is, but they have a big marketing budget and they've pushed that out into the world.
Right.
Yeah. So, you transitioned into wood finishes. Do you mostly work with like architects and designers, or do you work with homeowners, or do you do a mixture?
I work with architects and designers. And
Okay.
because now I've transitioned again. Now I pretty much consult.
Okay.
I I had an accident out of work in 2010 and was not able to work for almost a year.
Oh
So
goodness. Yeah.
that was the end of my company.
Yeah. That
So
makes it hard. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, it's still, there are definitely clients that want to capture X, and it's really hard when your vendors, your contractor, subcontractor can only give you Y, not
Right. Yeah.
X.
Well, and I think some of that is that people don't know what's out there. People don't know what's possible. So they just go in and look at, what's available on the shelf and think that they're getting the
Absolutely.
best thing. And it's not
Absolutely.
and it's not always. I see that a lot in just material selection in general, and paint's even worse because of all of the regulations. And I'm sure you're very aware of the quality of paint now.
Oh,
Yeah. So
it's funny. When I work, as I said, I work all over the country, and I tell my clients, I said, your answers are not at the paint store.
right.
They're just not. A paint store has a function. They do sell some products, but you need to understand where you're getting your information from. Your information is coming from a salesman, and his information or her information is coming from the vendor that's
Right.
they're
The
representing,
manufacturer. Yeah. Yeah.
which is nothing more than a chemical company. Get that.
Yeah.
Understand that.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah. I never had thought about it that way, of it being a chemical company, but it is, and they just keep making new formulas up.
And they change them at will
They do.
because they have shareholders, and shaving pennies times a million adds up.
Oh yeah. 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 And that is very true. And it makes it hard to be able to recommend a finish that will last. So I think it's good to expose people to what options are out there and in the
Hmm.
world, because not everybody, you don't just walk into a store and find the solution that will work best for you.
No, no, and sometimes, I always tell people to actually buy the best you can, but sometimes spending the most money doesn't make sense because that product obviously may not work in your situation.
Right. And
And
sometimes you're buying it's like any other luxury product, and I'll use that loosely because it's not exactly the same, but sometimes you're paying for the name and not necessarily the quality.
absolutely, oh,
Yeah.
there's plenty of
Yeah.
examples of that in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So and you've talked about your process a little bit. So you're trying to bring out the grain using different colors and different um organic processes. And then and you, on your website, you talk about it being enhanced by art and science. Can you explain that a little bit more, and like what your process is?
Sure. So when I say enhanced by art and science, and I view color and wood finishing as an art, because the traditional method is really not focused on art. It's focused on producing X with whatever color, slathering it on and putting a protective coat, and that's the world we live in today. But
Right.
if you approach it, like when I go to companies and I teach color as well, because color is by far the most important skill you can have in finishing, period. Period. It is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one that most companies struggle with. And so when I go to help companies understand how to get color, I tell them, I said, the most important thing you have to control is the undertone of color. So let's just say, I make this color, this finish in mahogany, and my client wants it in walnut. Now, the the common thought would be I'll just take whatever that stain is on the mahogany and I'll put it on walnut. Well, that's not going to get the color.
No, because you don't have the same wood species. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
yeah.
So, if you just control the undertone, you have to make that brown wood red first in order to put your color on. It's quick.
Right.
But so my method of art and science is that I build color out in layers. When I was a contractor, specifically when I worked in preservation or restoration, the most important material that I used was shellac.
Right.
Shellac is everything. Now there are companies that sell pre-made shellac at a coating store, and it's technically shellac, but it's been modified.
Right.
Because shellac, after you make it, has a 6-month shelf life, period.
Yeah.
Then it degrades. Now, I was, I worked all over the country, and I never met anyone that bought as much shellac as we did, ever.
Right.
We had a special license. We had 200 proof alcohol delivered to us in 55-gallon drums. And in the heyday of shellac for us was about a 8 or 9 year period. And that 8 or 9 years, I personally bought more than a metric ton of shellac flake.
Oh my goodness, that's a huge amount of shellac.
It's a huge amount of shellac. I mean, there were years that we went through 300 kilograms in a year. I mean, that's over 600 pounds.
Yeah, that's
a raw flake.
Yeah. And then you're mixing it with the alcohol and getting it to dissolve. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the process is huge.
Right. Yeah.
When you do this.
Yeah.
So
And it's the same as I'm sure you're aware too. It's like the same as like going in and getting tung oil. You need to make sure you're getting pure tung oil and not, tung oil finish, because there are words on the bottles, but they do not mean the same thing.
No, they do not.
So yeah, I definitely understand that. So when you were using the shellac, were you using that on like trim and things, or were you using it mostly on antiques, like refinishing?
We were actually doing houses.
Okay.
And we would take, as word grew that we existed, clients would call us and they would want it's not necessarily that they wanted the antique finish, is that I would design finishes that would utilize shellac, reactive color, glares. I mean, we would go into people's houses and to buildings and actually fill the grain. Nobody does this.
Right. Like, so like instead of, and let me make sure I understand what you mean. Instead of like using like a wood fill, you would actually go in and like fill out the grain and then finish it. Is that what you mean?
No. So
okay.
In open grain woods like oak, and
okay.
I'm not a fan of red oak, as I've said.
I don't know many people that are in the business.
Yeah. White oak is a different animal.
Right.
I love white oak. I mean, white oak is my most favorite wood to play with because it's so versatile.
Right.
But the thing that would bother me, and it still bothers me today when I go into buildings or residences where I see that they've used, let's say it's ash or oak or mahogany, even walnut has grain.
Right.
And if you don't fill it, you miss out on depth. And so it's the pores of the wood.
Oh, I understand. Yeah.
So if you look at a piece of fine furniture, that grain is filled primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the day, in the 1600s, 1700s, they were using rotten stone or other materials in a slurry to fill the grain. So, but we adapted, and we would you could design a finish to say, if you're trying to build patina, you could color the grain to show that age, but not fully fill it, because it takes more than one application to fill the grain because it shrinks. So
Oh,
we would
yeah,
use
the
it
wood's
as
reacting. Yeah.
building patina and depth. But again, process is everything.
Oh, yeah.
So the standard finish for us, the very base minimum we did was 7 layers of, color, shellac, filler, shellac again, glaze, another layer shellac. I mean, and it's not thick. These are super
Right.
thin layers.
Oh, yeah. Shellac goes on really, really thin, and it takes thousands of layers to get a French polish. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's really, yeah, that is a process, and I'm sure it's very time consuming.
And on top of that, the thing that I wanted when I had my company was it was about craft.
Yes.
And so we hand applied everything. We did not spray. Everything was done by hand.
Yeah.
And there is a huge difference. Brushing
There is.
shellac is a skill because it dries instantly.
Yeah, the alcohol evaporates quickly.
Right.
So, and you get a very different, the spraying I know is very popular because it's fast.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and so then you
very
save
fast.
time, but you don't get the same finish. You don't, I mean, when we,
it's not even close.
Yeah. When we just, a regular, painting, something that we're going to install, to have those brush marks, that makes it, look like it would have looked before rather than everything being so smooth and you have to thin the paint so much to spray it too. So I don't,
Right.
there's a whole bunch of issues with spraying.
About brushing too is that, I know people today, some clients want brushed finishes, and what most painters do is they do a technique called tipping, which is essentially they spray on the coat
and then
they
brush
just
a little. Yeah.
brush a little. Now to me, we brushed everything, and you couldn't we could brush away that you wouldn't see the brush marks.
Right. Yeah.
That's the skill level that I went after.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's definitely, there is huge differences just in finishing in general between the quality of paint jobs that you get, just based on, who's doing it and how much they prepare the surface, not even talking about how specialized your work is. There's huge varieties.
I know it's
variations.
It's interesting when I do go back and look at projects that we did, say 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're still in fantastic shape. 25 years ago with,
that's amazing.
Kids and dogs and that
yes.
beat the heck out of a house, but it lasts.
Yeah. And there's
a reason why.
Yeah. And the more traditional materials tend to be more durable and more forgiving in high use situations, because they didn't want to have to maintain, not that they didn't maintain, but they didn't want to have to paint every 5 years or whatever a modern solution would be.
And that's today is, it's not to say that there aren't good good industrial level finishes out there.
Right.
There are, and there are some good innovative coatings on the market today.
Yeah.
But as a homeowner, and even as a when a painting contractor comes to you, whether you're doing historic restoration or new houses or remodeling or whatever you're doing, you assume that person is bringing products to you that add value to you.
Right.
And that's really not the case.
No.
It's really about, it benefits them.
Yeah.
And nothing.
Right. And of the overall cost of the job, the materials, especially for painting, are minimal.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
To do some research, yeah.
I know. Part of what I do right now is consult with architects and designers, and I tell them, I'm giving you unbiased information. I have no benefit for telling you these products. And I'll just give you a typical example. in a commercial environment today, when you're doing a huge building, most architects or designers pick a color, and then they just leave it up to their contractor to match that color using whatever paint.
Right.
They don't care. But you're really not adding value to your client, because if you come in and say, we're going to use this paint, this specific product, because this product is going to be able to maintain the walls or woodwork in this building. But the contractor, his objective is, in the long run, is to get a color on that lasts for not long.
Right.
It's about benefiting his bottom line.
Right.
And by choosing a specific paint, at least in Minnesota, in a union environment, it costs for one journeyman $150,000 a year, to maintain your building. If you spent, say, an extra 20 grand between what you spec'd and what they're buying, you could get the maintenance that's already in your building to
Right.
clean the walls instead of repainting the walls. It happens every day.
Right. No, and that's very true. And the other thing that I've noticed when people are researching is that, like, they don't take into account the different environments.
Right.
And so something that works really well in one area of the country might not work well in another area where there's less humidity or more humidity. And so, understanding how the building works and the environment that you're in also helps with, choosing that. I know in our area, we have a really hard time with getting linseed oil based paint to cure correctly, and a lot of it mildews.
Right.
So, but that's what a lot of people want to use. And I'm like, no, you don't want to use that. And this is why. And, sometimes you just have to give your best advice and then let them make decisions.
Yeah. There's some really, as I tell my clients, I said, there are fantastic paints made and manufactured in the world today. It's just that predominantly they're not made in America.
Right. It's true.
All European companies.
Yeah.
There are some smaller boutique companies in the United States. There are. I'm not going to say there aren't.
Yeah.
But they're not readily available, so they don't have a market share.
Right.
So people don't know about them.
Yeah. Yeah. And finding someone like you that, has your pulse on all of the different options is very beneficial, especially if you're going to, spend a considerable amount of money, and then you don't want to do that again in, less than 10 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah. Let's see. And I know you've talked about your consulting work. Do you do any hands-on work still, or is it just mostly consulting?
I will take on a project under one circumstance, and it's really this. I want to be challenged.
Okay.
If I'm challenged, if it's something that it takes, let's say, brain power to figure out, then I'm all in. I'm not. I've solved so many problems that are easy for me and daunting for people because they don't think like I do. They don't really understand what's out there. And so things that flummox or stop architects and designers literally take no time. They don't. I worked for a company, a large architectural firm, who had been building out 3 floors of a building for this financial services firm. And they'd spent 8 months trying to get their vendors, 8 months, 5 different vendors to match this one color. And the premise I went to them was, bring me in at the beginning. I will make the formulas for all 5 people. The floor guy, the woodwork guy, the furniture guy, they'll all be different.
Right.
Because they all use different products.
Yeah.
But they will all match.
Oh, that would be a challenge.
And so they're 8 months in, the client was moving in like 6 weeks. And they didn't have a finished approved yet. And I made that color in an hour and a half. An hour and a half.
Oh my goodness, that's
They
fast.
spent
Yeah.
8 months because they don't think that it's not hard.
Right.
So, I had them back on track, and I made a formula for every single one of those guys, those companies, based on my path.
Right. Well, and sometimes that experience, brings, I know there's times that I can look at something and say, oh, I know exactly what's wrong here. Like, like especially water problems. Like I can look at it and say, oh, I know. And then I'll tell, whoever I'm talking to, and they're like, oh, I don't think that's it. And then we come, we keep revisiting it.
Oh, I know.
So yeah, I get that. But I think sometimes, and I know living, just being in my own head, I don't always value the experience I have because it's just natural to me now because I've been doing this so long. Yeah,
absolutely. And people discount it because they, that's impossible.
Right.
And what I've learned over the years is, well, it's impossible for you because you play in this lane. And again, another analogy is like you play in a sandbox. I play on the beach. So really, there are so many things available around the world. And if you take the time to understand the chemistry, and it's really important that you do. And you don't have to have a PhD in polymer science, because I don't. But I understand the chemistry.
Right.
Coatings are 3 things, period. 3. And then everything else they put in it. And once you grasp that, then you can discern what works best in what environment.
Right. In
what that application.
Yeah. That definitely is true. So I know we kind of talked about how your business got started. Is there anything that you wish you knew when you got started that you know now, or?
Well, as I said, when I got started, I assumed, like a lot of people assumed, that the coating store was where all the answers were. And it's just not. Because really, you don't have a worldview. I didn't at that point.
Right.
I didn't understand what was available. And as I took the time to look and to understand and to learn, my world broadened substantially.
Well, and I think that's the not knowing what you don't know too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I ask a lot of questions. I mean, trust me, people that know me, it can get annoying at times. I acknowledge that, but that's how I process. I ask questions, and I challenge people to, give me information that they don't have. And if they don't have it, then I know that's not the path for me. If you can't explain to me why your whatever is the latest and greatest, that makes sense to me, not just the verbiage you're being taught to say.
Yeah.
But the real information, the chemistry. Tell me why.
Yeah. I think that I do that similarly too, because I think if I understand the why, then it's easier for me to then figure the rest out.
Right.
But yeah, if you're just trying to sell me, that doesn't usually work very well.
No.
So, what trends or challenges do you see in preservation?
So I think the biggest challenge that's happening, and it's going to happen, is that in the United States and around the world too, is that solvent-borne systems are on their way out. And this is a huge issue when you're playing with shellac, because even though it's alcohol and it's an organic product, it still has a high VOC content.
Right.
So over the years, I learned how to actually make shellac with water. And it is possible to make shellac with water.
Oh my goodness, that's pretty amazing.
So, because if you look, one of the most important factors to understand with coatings is pH. And so you understand that shellac is an acid. Well, so if you change the water, and water is actually a solvent, if you
Right.
look at it in that
Yeah.
terms, it is a solvent. If you change the pH of the water, you can get the shellac to melt.
That makes sense.
So that's what I
Yeah,
did.
from a chemical standpoint, that makes sense to me. I don't think I would have ever. I don't think I would have thought, but I wouldn't have. I don't know if I would have thought to change the pH of the water, but that makes sense because then you could get it to do the dissolving that it needs to do. Does that significantly lower the VOCs then?
Yeah, it does.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that there's a lot of things you can do with coatings.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I did study at times, and one of the places I studied was with this gentleman named Don Williams. And Don Williams, he's since retired now, but he, at the time, was the senior conservator for furniture and decorative objects at the Smithsonian. And I would study with him. Now, I consider myself fairly above average when it comes to knowledge. I feel stupid next to him. I'll just tell you that, because that guy is, wow, super smart. But what I learned from him was a lot of ways to manipulate coatings. I used to take my shellac because I loved shellac, but when you put it on for a final film, it's not really moisture resistant and it's not solvent resistant.
Right.
But because in the conservation world, conservators use other products. One of the things that they use are these things called acryloids. And acryloids are a specific acrylic resins. And ethical conservators, put down a barrier coat on top of antiques and then put the repairs on top. Because you're normally, and you're writing reports to say that.
Right, yeah.
But you can take these acryloids and put them in your shellac, and you can modify the film to make it moisture resistant and solvent resistant. But it's still shellac. And
right.
I did this. And you can actually put other things in there that can boost the UV resistance times 100. But it doesn't change the look, the
or
feel,
the product. Yeah.
or the product. Yeah. So
yeah, that's interesting because that is one of the reasons that, using a shellac finish in, like on furniture where people are going to actually use it, not in a museum, is hard because, if somebody sets down, not thinking, sets down a glass, any of those things can, cause problems.
But that's true. But shellac is the only really between that and nitrous lacquer that's fixable.
It is. Shellac is very forgiving in that way. Yeah, that is true.
Melt it back down and it's gone.
Yeah, that is very true. So how can our listeners, or is there anything else you want to share with us that we didn't cover?
Not really. I mean, I honestly, I guess the thing that's really important is for people to understand that specifically when you're playing in the preservation world or restoration or, historic properties, is to know that it is possible to match what you have in new. It just is not from the paint store. It's not from the coating store. And there are a lot of people that mean well. They do. But they don't understand what they're playing with that's on there. So if you have a house, pre-1850 house, it's not likely shellac. You cannot take modern coatings and put them on top of these finishes.
Right.
And this is what happens in a lot of commercial restoration, buildings, state capitals, things like that. And there's disastrous results. And I've seen it. You can't clean wood like that and then put what's the common path, which is pre-catalyzed lacquer. It looks great for about a year. And then the oils migrate to the surface, and now you've got a cloudy mess.
Right.
And it's not something that you can fix.
No.
And now you're starting over.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think if people understood that and understood the process, different decisions would be made. So I thank you very much for agreeing to come on and talk with me about it. How can our listeners contact you?
Well, I have a website which I need to update soon, but my I assume you'll put my contact information on this
Yes,
podcast.
and it'll be on our site also, on
And
where the podcast will live.
so I work, as I say, all over the country, and I do have, for private projects, an elite crew that I bring with me, because that I vet and know.
Right.
Because that, when you're playing in that world, they don't. I never worked in the world where, a client wants X, you get X, not X
Right.
plus 1, not Y, not Z, X.
Right.
And so that takes a different level of knowledge and talent to pull that off.
Right.
So that's that. Yeah.
Okay.
It's been great to be on.
Yeah, very good. And did I see you have classes or anything like that? Did I see that on your website?
Yes, and so I'm actually been working on writing a book.
Okay.
And I'm working on writing a book that's predominantly about my approach, which is way different than others. And, it's material driven. There are books out there about reactive color, but they're like picture books. They don't tell you why or how. And as you know, when you play with reactive color, it is a chemical reaction at its base level. You do not control it. You guide it.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
And there's things that go awry, and you need to know what to do. And trust me, I've made every mistake that is possible to make with reactive color. And I know how to go backwards.
Right.
And go forwards with it.
I think that's probably the biggest skill to have, is to know how to reverse what you did so that you can go forward again.
Yeah, because you understand the chemical reaction is based on the pH of the wood. Again, the science part is huge in creating extraordinary. And if you can grasp these principles, there's nothing you can't figure out.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. Well, when you have your book out, let me know, and I'll make sure that we, get that on the podcast portion of the website too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.